Welcome back to Afrodo Reviews. On this channel, I help you decide, is that book worth reading of a second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? Let's find out. I have to apologize real quick for my new glasses. They are reflecting everything. Oh my god. Been trying to figure out how to dim it down, but I cannot find a good way. So, apologies. What you're seeing on my computer screen is the video capture. Today's book is The Last Bookstore on Earth, which is a young adult post-apocalyptic novel published on January 7th of 2025 by Lily Braun-Arnold as her debut work. It was chosen as Barnes & Noble's YA Book Club pick for the month of January, while also being labeled as Indie's Next Kid's #1 pick for January/February. Apart from that, it probably due to the relatively recent release date as of the time of my recording and publishing this, The Last Bookstore on Earth doesn't really have that much in terms of background, at least not so much that I could find. So, here's the report card. And then we move on to the cover. Now, the cover of this book isn't that great. There are certainly elements to it that fit within the story inside of it, and it does have a somewhat eye-catching contrast in its colors between the fires here and the golden plants up against the darker gray and black background. It's not something I look at. The problem is, it's just not something I look at when I have further knowledge in the book and like. I do like the fact that when you take a closer look at the much darker flowers, you can see them made from pages of a book, mind you. But overall, the cover itself doesn't tell you anything about what's happening within the book itself. The golden flowers on the cover here, pretty irrelevant. The fire and all these embers, including the little scorch here of the O slowly being burned away. I don't think there's a single instance in this book where fire ever matters to the story. And it actually ended up kind of tricking me into expecting the climax to go one way, when in reality it went a different way. At best, I think the cover is slightly referencing a line in the epilogue, but by then it's a little too late to actually reference it. Apart from that, that's pretty much all there is for the dust cover. The book itself, the hardcover on it, isn't anything but a yellow and black. But let's move on to the synopsis. As normal, I will read from the book and give you what the book is willing to let you know and what impressions it wants you to have going into it. And then, depending on what I read, I'll fill you in on what I feel is needed to understand the context of my review. So, without further ado, ever since the first storm wreaked havoc on the civilization as we know it, 17-year-old Liz Flannery has been holed up in an abandoned bookstore where she used to work, trading books for supplies with the few remaining survivors. It's the one place left that feels safe, until she learns that another earth-shattering storm is coming, and everything changes. Enter Maeve, a prickly and potentially dangerous out-of-towner who breaks into the bookstore looking for shelter one night. Though the two girls are immediately at odds, Maeve has what Liz needs: the skills to repair the dilapidated shop before the next climate disaster strikes, and Liz reluctantly agrees to let her stay. As the girls grow closer and undeniable feelings spring up between them, they realize that they face greater threats than the impending storm. And when Maeve's secrets and Liz's inner demons come back to haunt them both, they find themselves fighting for their lives as their world crumbles. In this searing post-apocalyptic debut from a groundbreaking new voice, author Lily Braun-Arnold explores the endurance of hope and humanity and the power of books, asking what will survive in an uncertain future and what's truly worth saving. Honestly, yeah, that's a pretty good synopsis. I don't think I really need to add anything to what you need to know about this book going in that won't just be spoilers for the context of my review. So let's go ahead and move on to that. Just a reminder, I'm going to start with a non-spoiler section and talk about what I can of the book without giving away any of the major plot details or anything like that. And then I'm going to move on to a spoiler section where the complaints I have about the book require me to spoil some elements of the book. Now, while the spoiler section won't be too big on actual plot reveals, I am I am going to be spoiling the end of the book because I want to talk about certain elements of this book that require me to talk about the end. So, before I switch over, I will give a 5-second warning, and that'll be a cue to go ahead and go down to the chapter system and skip past the spoiler section if you just want to move straight on to the conclusion. So, without further ado, what did I think about this book? What did I think about The Last Bookstore on Earth? Well, apparently I find myself at odds with the popular opinion if Goodreads is anything to go by, and I'll say that I loved the book. Subjectively speaking. Yes, truthfully, the book is a great read, and I was pretty engaged with it from start to finish. I like how the first part of the book really conveys the loneliness that Liz goes through, showing how she's living her life in a post-apocalyptic world, and the mental mindscape she's living through just before Maeve shows up. I will also say, unlike other book-themed books, which is a weird sentence in itself to say, this one actually feels like our protagonist is a reader. You might remember a review I made a couple years ago called The Bookish Life of Nina Hill. Or on a book called The Bookish Life of Nina Hill, I should say. And those of you who do remember will know that one of my big critiques of the book was that it almost felt like the book was mocking avid readers more than it was anything else. So much so that I actually made a second video wondering if the book was just innocently insensitive or was purposely pushing negative stereotypes about avid readers, while also using the idea that being an avid reader as window dressing for character traits, rather than actual personality. I mentioned one of the reasons I felt this way was because the book itself never really seemed to have Nina, our main character, really reference any books that would show she's a reader. Books weren't really a part of the plot. At most, we saw a couple references to Harry Potter, which is a very popular movie series in addition to books. And all said and done, everything you could say about the Harry Potter series these days, the adaptations from book to movie were still pretty faithful. So it doesn't really count much in that regard of proving Nina Hill was a big reader. She never really talks about books that the mainstream audience wouldn't heard of. She doesn't read books we haven't heard of. It's something that even the most basic person would understand when they read it.
Reading? Mm-hmm. I didn't know you could read.
This is not true of Liz, who is consistently discussing books and is written with such an ease of familiarity with the books that I can buy that she's an actual avid reader without thinking she's a caricature. Especially when Maeve, who isn't an avid reader, shows up. Admittedly, I didn't quite get the joke with Maeve calling Liz Elizabeth Swann, in reference to the Pirates of the Caribbean series, because as of the time this was published, the Pirates of the Caribbean series has kind of just lost all real relevance. Like, I genuinely did not remember that they released that last movie, and I was like, oh, okay, so that came out. So I just think that was a little weird of a choice. I actually, the only reason I let it slide was because I think Maeve would have been pretty young when those came out, so I could understand that making a mental imprint on her character. But another benefit I would say about this book is it is a pretty easy read too. And I say that in both the good and bad way. The bad is that because it is still a YA book. So I mean that in the sense that it's an easy read in the way that most YA books are. But it's also an easy read because I just liked reading it, and I didn't really want to put it down when I was reading it. I always love books that can grab my attention that way, enough that I find myself making excuses throughout the day to just get back to that book and read one more chapter. And you know what? That chapter was a little short. Just one more. Just one more chapter. You know what? I can live off of 6 hours of sleep and work the next day. Just one more chapter. Something that scratches that itch for me, It happened with Kenobi, and I loved Kenobi. So, it happened with, it happened with really good books normally. Now, another thing. I don't want to keep comparing this book to other books that I didn't like, but one of the other comparisons that I want to make in this book's favor is with A Language of Dragons, the book I read and reviewed just before this. Now, my review of this is out by now, so you know that one of my big complaints of the book is that our main character, Vivian, becomes rather unlikable about her actions throughout the story, especially in regards to the secret she kept about how she had a hand in her best friend's demotion to a third-class citizen. And I mentioned that the actual thing she did was so directly a malicious act against someone who was supposed to be her best friend, a friend that throughout the book was described sort of like a sister to her, that it made it hard to like her even with all the lip service in the book about how guilty she felt about doing it. Because she did it without being coerced into it, she just did this so directly malicious act that I found it really hard to believe that this person was her best friend. I want to say that this book does do the same kind of twists, in that same vein, not necessarily the same twist, to be clear. With our main character having a dark secret about a hand she had in the fate of someone she was close to, and they do it much better. And how in the end it actually does explain pretty well about the many things that Liz feels throughout the book, while also not being so terrible that it does remove a lot of the sympathy you would have gained for Liz throughout the book. You don't read the actions that she took and been like, wow, that's messed up.
Wow, that's messed up.
One of the things that I will mention here in the non-spoiler section in terms of critique is that I don't feel this book really explored its apocalyptic world. For the most part, the setting is entirely around the bookstore, and it's more of a character study in itself of the characters of Maeve and Liz. Because of that, we never really get a sense of how the world is outside of that shop. We don't know how most of the world is coping if it's not within the bookstore. We mostly just get Maeve mentioning that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And a part of this is an issue because Lily Braun-Arnold actually had an amazing idea how to explore the world without leaving the bookshop. But she doesn't do anything substantial with this element. You see, throughout the book, we get these little snippets from a journal that Liz is keeping about the various stories she's collecting about patrons from her store. These stories are basically, I'm not going to spoil why she starts getting them because that's a little bit much, but she starts collecting stories from the various patrons who come into her store and get books. And we get them spread throughout at the end of chapters most normally. There's a couple here that are in between chapters, but that's explained fine. And it's a really great way to explore the world outside of Liz's perspective, since this is a first-person point of view book. But here's the problem. We only see about 6 or so of these stories in a 300-page book. And none of them are longer than a page worth of story, often in the vaguest sense and only talking about the very start of the storm and the post-apocalyptic setting. In fact, there was a point in this book that the gap between these little stories and the main story was so wide, I kind of forgot that Lily Braun-Arnold was doing this in her book. And I found this particularly weird because this would have really helped expand the scope of her story. Really helped her just flesh out the setting of this world that is post-storm. But with that being said, admittedly, I'm having a bit of a hard time talking about parts of this book that require me to stay in the non-spoiler section. That doesn't just sound like repeats of what I've already said before, or kind of disjointed talking points. So without further ado, here's your chance to skip ahead to the conclusion if you don't want to hear any more of my spoiler-ish reviews. It won't be, as I said before, it won't be super spoiler heavy because I do still want people to go read this book, but it does require me to spoil basically the climax and the end of the book because there is parts of this book I have to talk about in regards to that. So, here's your 5-second warning to go ahead and skip ahead if you don't want to hear spoilers. And on we move. Okay, so a lot of you noticed that when I read the synopsis of this book, I actually read part of the synopsis that I don't normally read. In the searing post-apocalyptic debut of this groundbreaking new voice, author Lily Braun-Arnold explores the endurance of hope, humanity, and the power of books, asking what will survive in an uncertain future. And in the Goodreads description itself, is that it favorably compares itself to works such as Station 11 and The Last of Us, which both explore such themes as what is mentioned in the dust cover. The problem I had with this, and the reason I read it at all, is because doesn't really do that, at least not in a sufficient way, that I could say that's a core theme of this book. To get the easy one out of the place, the story itself, despite being set in a bookstore, the actual effects that books themselves have on the plot is incredibly minimal. The bookstore is less of a real place and more of a representation of Liz's security blanket, for lack of a better word. The place she stays because it's ultimately what makes her feel safe and grounded. To the point that she'd rather die than leave it for any significant length of time, let alone forever. The actual books in the story don't weigh in much. There's no real point in this book where books are the hero of the story. The setting of the bookstore is a backdrop to a character study on Liz and Maeve more than it is an exploration on the theme of the power of books. Notable that May is not an avid reader at the start and doesn't change her mind throughout the story. Liz doesn't even look at the various dystopic and post-apocalyptic works that she's constantly referencing in any form of inspirations or motivations to anything she does throughout the story. In fact, at one point they were referencing Crime and Punishment, and I thought, okay, well, this is a good book to reference in a book that's also exploring the endurance of hope and humanity. Especially since that's a lot of the themes of Crime and Punishment, you know, the morality of punishing criminals, all that stuff. Doesn't do that. The most reason Crime and Punishment is referenced is because they're referencing to Ava and her. Ava is a good friend of hers that left her behind but comes back later. That Ava and her tried to memorize the first page when they were just incredibly bored one day at work. That's it. Just referencing a story that has similar themes to your book does not count as adding the theme of the power of books in your work.
It's not a fucking book. It's a weapon. A weapon aimed right at the hearts and minds of the weak and the desperate.
I will say the theme it does explore the most is the exploration of humanity, and it's probably the strongest actual theme in the story. We take long looks at who Liz is, and when we learn her secret, we understand the various reasons that she has such strong, strange opinions that seem to run counterintuitive to her survival. And we see what humanity is willing to do in cases of extreme crisis, but also what parts of humanity can't do these horrible things, even in the worst moments. I don't necessarily think the theme is done entirely well, to be honest, but it is done much better in comparison to the other two, where you really kind of have to make out any passable moments that really just cement that theme in the story. Like, there's at no point where we really question humanity or the animals we can turn into in our worst moments, but also the great people we can be in those worst moments. There's various references to it. Like I said, Maeve constantly talks about how things went bad elsewhere, but in the story itself, it's not really explored. Even Maeve isn't really that untrustworthy, all things said and done. She's not as morally gray as I think Lily Braun-Arnold was hoping she was. Honestly, I really wish the endurance of hope, though, that theme, was better played with, because I think that's the theme the story would have benefited the most from having. The story itself always seems to play with the idea of hope, kind of like pinching at it every so often. But at best, it states that Liz is a little naive to hold on to hope the way she does, but it's a part of her character, so we can forgive it. When her friend Ava returns, the person whose presence Liz wanted most during the early parts of the book, she hopes Ava will stay, and continues to hold out that hope even when it's revealed that Ava is actually part of a group of bandits that are going to come to the bookstore and kill Liz and Maeve if they don't leave. Because Liz made a foolish choice to reveal the fact that she has a working generator to someone she thought she could trust. Admittedly, there's not even a point in the dialogue or in the story itself where Maeve, who holds significantly less hope than Liz, is ever challenged in that more hopeful way where a climactic scene pays off with that theme. For example, one good way that it could have been done is that during the moment where Maeve has seemingly given up on trying to save Liv and make her leave the bookstore, we never see a moment where Liz is still hoping that Maeve will return. She thinks Maeve has abandoned her and doesn't think Maeve will come back. In that same way, while she wants Ava to come back, she also doesn't seem to have any actual hope that Ava will return. It's all very false hopes. It's lies she tells herself that she's aware are lies. She doesn't hope they come back. She's lying to herself that they will. I think a part of this is because the climax doesn't quite do anything with these themes. You see, the climax is a group of bandits come over to take the bookstore when Liz tells someone she thought she could trust about her working generator. The final pages of the book are a struggle between our protagonist defending the shop and the antagonist sieging it. Now, originally, the main reason this disappointed me is because, like I said, the book had me convinced the climax was going to go a different route. You see, I thought Liz was finally going to decide to make steps to abandon the bookshop, realizing that she was indeed using it as a security blanket to cope with the trauma of the first storm and her anxiety even before that about leaving the places she's comfortable with. That she was going to burn the bookshop down before the bandits got there and walk off to find Maeve with the instructions left for her. It would certainly explain the fire on the cover, and it felt like it was set up within the story, as a couple times the book references a box of matches that she has, as well as the fact that she has so many books, so many just things kind of tossed around that it would be easy to start a fire. I think at one point she even references how easily her place would catch fire if there was ever an open flame she couldn't control. It would also go kind of well with the theme of the book, the endurance of hope and humanity and stuff, where she chooses, instead of holding on to the false hope that this bookstore got her, she embraces the hope that her life can get better by leaving behind the trauma that she has, burning down the bookstore so she can't force herself to come back, while also spiting the bandits who are just gonna come there and take what's theirs for no reason, with no attempt at diplomacy.
Let it burn.
Huh?
But all Dad's stuff!
No, I think it's alright.
But instead, no, the book just kind of ends with both her and Maeve killing one of the bandits, Ava getting killed trying to do the right thing, and then the last two bandits forming an uneasy truce sort of out of nowhere and leaving them alone when the second storm hits during their siege. All this legwork showing how Liz is using the bookshop as an emotional crutch ultimately goes nowhere because in the end, she's validated for that crutch and managed to keep the shop despite everything in the book telling us that she needs to let it go in order to mentally move on from the trauma she's experienced. Even if Liz and Maeve decided to go to Liv's house a 10-minute walk away, I think it would have been better since it had at least shown the personal growth on Liz's behalf, and her being willing to confront past trauma in order to live a better life for the future. Heck, admittedly, even if Braun-Arnold wanted to keep the bookshop in play and defeat the bandits, I would have recommended that she remove the second storm arriving during the fight, and instead did something where the various clients of the bookshop show up when all hope seems lost. Realizing the bookshop, and by extension Liz, is in trouble, we see the various patrons referenced throughout the story who have used the bookshop and have just kind of formed an easy relationship with Liz show up and begin to chase off the bandits. Then they all come together to quickly help her retrofit the shop for the coming storm in the final battles. I think that would have played a little bit better into the exploration of humanity and the endurance of hope, with the community coming together to defend a staple of their lives from people who are threatening to destroy it for their own selfish gain. You know, a lot like those scenes from the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man films.
Come on up here, dumb guy. I got a little something for you.
Kick your freaking ass!
Leave Spider-Man alone. You gonna pick on a guy trying to save a bunch of kids? Oh, yeah, I got something for your ass. You mess with Spidey, you mess with New York. You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us.
This unfortunately also kind of makes Liz a bit of a stagnant character because she doesn't ever move on. She's not forced to change or adapt at all as she clings to her ideals and her comforts even past the point of logic, and at the end of the story, she still has everything she clung to. And more. She doesn't have to sacrifice anything for her actions, or for her reluctance to change, her willingness to sever personal relationships because of her security blanket. Heck, it even gets a bit frustrating when Liz herself is openly acknowledging her faults and problems, but never actually tries to change them. She doesn't try to evolve as a person. Also, while we're on the subject, it does feel a little weird to see Goodreads label this as a dystopian work. I mean, yeah, I get it. A dystopia is technically a setting characterized by great suffering or injustice. But at the same time, it feels more just like a post-apocalypse. When I think dystopia, I think Hunger Games, The Giver, Snowpiercer. That's the kind of thing where the society might be post-apocalyptic, but it's showing that while it might be utopic for some, it's a place largely where others suffer. If you told me that The Last of Us was dystopic, I would say, technically you're right, but it's not a work I think of when you tell me dystopia. In the same way that I wouldn't say the same thing about Station 11 either. I guess when it's all said and done, 6 out of 10. So I want to say that personally, on a purely subjective scale about how much I enjoyed this book, it was definitely more of a 7 or 8. However, when I sat back and really thought about how it's explored its themes and how it went about its story, I realized that while I did personally really enjoy the book, it did have a lot of issues. A lot like White House Down. I really love that movie, but I'm not going to tell you that it's the height of cinema. It's a fun popcorn flick movie to me that I think has great moments, even in terms of themes, but not something I would defend to my last breath about it being amazing, you know? I guess in terms of this book, like I said, I wish it had explored its themes better. That's the main downfall of this book. I think if this book wasn't promising to explore certain themes and was just being the story that it told, I think I might have accepted the fault of it a little better, as opposed to having to really dissect all the problems with this book the way I did. I would, when it comes to whether or not it deserves Mount Doom, the answer is no, obviously. I probably will reread this book. It's one of those books I might just reread in the future to see if that goodwill still holds up. But at the same time, I'm not in love with the book when I think about it theme-wise. I will recommend reading it, but I would just say if you do go in, don't think of it as in comparison to The Last of Us or Station 11. Definitely don't think of it as exploring the endurance of hope, humanity, and the power of books. Just read it as based on everything before that. That's all I recommend you do. I still think it's a great book, but it has its problems. With that being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having, even the bad ones. See you later, everyone.